Section 15 of the Beacon Lights of History, Volume 1, The Old Pagan Civilizations. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. Beacon Lights of History, Volume 1, The Old Pagan Civilizations, by John Lord. Section 15, Phidias, Part 2. But the principles of all these three orders are substantially the same, their beauty consisting in the column and horizontal lines, even as vertical lines marked the Gothic. We see the lintel and not the arch, huge blocks of stone perfectly squared, and not small stones irregularly laid, external rather than internal pillars, the cellar receiving light from the open roof above rather than from windows, a simple outline, uninterrupted, generally in the form of a parallelogram, rather than broken by projections. There is no great variety, but the harmony, the severity, and beauty of proportion will eternally be admired, and can never be improved. A temple of humanity, cheerful, useful, complete, not aspiring to reach what on earth can never be obtained, with no gloomy vaults speaking of maceration and grief, no lofty towers and spires soaring to the sky, no emblems typical of consecrated sentiments and of immortality beyond the grave, but rich in ornaments drawn from the living world, of plants and animals, of man in the perfection of physical strength, of woman in unapproachable loveliness of grace of form. As the world becomes pagan, intellectual, thrifty, we see the architecture of the Greeks in palaces, banks, halls, theatres, stores, libraries. When it is emotional, poetic, religious, fervent, aspiring, we see the restoration of the Gothic in churches, cathedrals, schools. For philosophy and art did all they could to civilize the world before Christianity was sent to redeem it and prepare mankind for the life above. Such was the temple of the Greeks, reappearing in all the architectures of nations, from the Romans to our own times, so perfect that no improvements have subsequently been made, no new principles discovered, which were not known to Vitruvius. What a creation, to last in its simple beauty for more than 2000 years, and for ever to remain a perfect model of its kind! Ah, that was a triumph of art, the praises of which have been sung for more than 60 generations, and will be sung for hundreds yet to come. But how hidden and forgotten the great artist who invented all this, showing the littleness of man and the greatness of art itself! How true that old Greek saying, "Life is short, but art is long." But the genius displayed in sculpture was equally remarkable, and was carried to the same perfection. The Greeks did not originate sculpture. We read of sculptured images from the remotest antiquity. Assyria, Egypt, and India are all full of relics; but these are rude, unformed, without grace, without expression, though often colossal and grand. There are but few traces of emotion or passion or intellectual force. Everything which has come down from the ancient monarchies is calm, impassive, imperturbable. Nor is there a severe beauty of form. There is no grace, no loveliness that we should desire them. Nature was not severely studied. We see no aspiration after what is ideal. Sometimes the sculptures are grotesque, unnatural, and impure. They are emblematic of strange deities, or are rude moments of heroes and kings. They are curious, but they do not inspire us. We do not copy them, we turn away from them. They do not live, and they are not reproduced. Art could spare them all, except as illustrations of its progress. They are merely historical monuments to show despotism and superstition, and the degradation of the people. But this cannot be said of the statues which the Greeks created, or improved from ancient models. In the sculptures of the Greeks we see the utmost perfection of the human form, both of man and woman, learned by the constant study of anatomy and of nude figures of the greatest beauty. A famous statue represented the combined excellences of perhaps 100 different persons. The study of the human figure became a noble object of ambition, and led to conceptions of ideal grace and loveliness such as no one human being perhaps ever possessed in all respects. And not merely grace and beauty were thus represented in marble or bronze, but dignity, repose, majesty. We see in those figures, which have survived the ravages of time, suggestions of motion, rest, grace, grandeur, every attitude, every posture, every variety of form. We see also every passion which moves the human soul, grief, rage, agony, shame, joy, peace. but it is the perfection of form which is most wonderful and striking. Nor did the artists work to please the vulgar rich, but to realize their own highest conceptions and to represent sentiments in which the whole nation shared. They sought to instruct. They appealed to the highest intelligence. Some sought to represent tender beauty, others daring power, and others again heroic grandeur. Grecian statuary began with the ideal representations of deities, then it produced the figures of gods and goddesses in mortal forms, then the portrait statues of distinguished men. This art was later in its development than architecture, since it was directed to ornamenting what had already nearly reached perfection. Thus Phidias ornamented the Parthenon in the time of Pericles, when sculpture was purest and most ideal. In some points of view it declined after Phidias, but in other respects it continued to improve until it culminated in Lysippus, who was contemporaneous with Alexander. He is said to have executed 1,500 statues, and to have displayed great energy of execution. He idealized human beauty, and imitated nature to the minutest details. He alone was selected to make the statue of Alexander, which is lost. None of his works, which were chiefly in bronze, are extant, but it is supposed that the famous Hercules and the Torso Belvedere are copies from his works, since his favorite subject was Hercules. We only can judge of his great merits from his transcendent reputation and the criticism of classic writers, and also from the works that have come down to us which are supposed to be imitations of his masterpieces. It was his scholars who sculptured the Colossus of Rhodes, the Laocoon, and the Dying Gladiator. After him plastic art rapidly degenerated, since it appealed to passion, especially under Praxiteles, who was famous for his undraped Venuses and the expression of sensual charms. The decline of art was rapid as men became rich, and Epicurean life was sought as the highest good. Skill of execution did not decline, but ideal beauty was lost sight of, until the art itself was prostituted, as among the Romans, to please perverted tastes or to flatter senatorial pride. But our present theme is not the history of decline, but of the original creations of genius, which have been copied in every succeeding age, and which probably will never be surpassed, except in some inferior respects, in mere mechanical skill. The Olympian Jove of Phidias lives perhaps in the Moses of Michael, great as was his original genius, even as the Venus of Praxiteles may have been reproduced in Powers's Greek Slave. The great masters had innumerable imitators, not merely in the representation of man, but of animals. What a study did these artists excite, especially in their own age, and how honorable did they make their noble profession even in degenerate times! They were the schoolmasters of thousands and tens of thousands, perpetuating their ideas to remotest generations. Their instructions were not lost, and never can be lost in a realm which constitutes one of the proudest features of our own civilization. It is true that Christianity does not teach aesthetic culture, but it teaches the duties which prevent the eclipse of art. In this way it comes to the rescue of art when in danger of being perverted. Grecian art was consecrated to paganism, but revived it may indirectly be made tributary to Christianity, like music and eloquence. It will not conserve Christianity, but may be purified by it, even if able to flourish without it. I can now only glance at the third development of Grecian art, as seen in painting. It is not probable that such perfection was reached in this art as in sculpture and architecture. We have no means of forming incontrovertible opinions. Most of the ancient pictures have perished, and those that remain, while they show correctness of drawing and brilliant coloring, do not give us as high conceptions of ideal beauties as do the pictures of the great masters of modern times. But we have the testimony of the ancients themselves, who were as enthusiastic in their admiration of pictures as they were of statues. And since their taste was severe, and their sensibility as to beauty unquestioned, we have a right to infer that even painting was carried to considerable perfection among the Greeks. We read of celebrated schools, like the modern schools of Florence, Rome, Bologna, Venice, and Naples. The schools of Sicyon, Corinth, Athens, and Rhodes were as famous in their day as the modern schools to which I have alluded. Painting, being strictly a decoration, did not reach a high degree of art, like sculpture, until architecture was perfected. But painting is very ancient. The walls of Babylon, it is asserted by the ancient historians, were covered with paintings. Many survive amid the ruins of Egypt and on the chests of mummies, though these are comparatively rude, without regard to light and shade, like Chinese pictures. Nor do they represent passions and emotions. They aimed to perpetuate historical events, not ideas. The first paintings of the Greeks simply marked out the outlines of figures. Next appeared the inner markings as we see in ancient vases on a white ground. The effects of light and shade were then introduced, and then the application of colors in accordance with nature. Cimon of Cleonae, in the 80th Olympiad, invented the art of foreshortening, and hence was the first painter of perspective. Polygnotus, a contemporary of Phidias, was nearly as famous for painting as he was for sculpture. He was the first who painted woman with brilliant drapery and variegated headdresses. He gave to the cheek the blush, and to his draperies gracefulness. He is said to have been a great epic painter, as Phidias was an epic sculptor, and Homer an epic poet. He expressed, like them, ideal beauty. But his pictures had no elaborate grouping, which is one of the excellences of modern art. His figures were all in regular lines, like the bas reliefs on a frieze. He took his subjects from epic poetry. He is celebrated for his accurate drawing, and for the charm and grace of his female figures. He also gave great grandeur to his figures, like Michael Angelo. Contemporary with him was Dionysus, who was remarkable for expression, and Micon, who was skilled in painting horses. With Apollodorus of Athens, who flourished toward the close of the 5th century before Christ, there was a new development, that of dramatic effect. His aim was to deceive the eye of the spectator by the appearance of reality. He painted men and things as they appeared. He also improved coloring, invented chiaroscuro, or the art of relief by a proper distribution of the lights and shadows, and thus obtained what is called tone. He prepared the way for Zeuxis, who surpassed him in the power to give beauty to forms. The Helen of Zeuxis was painted from 5 of the most beautiful women of Croton. He aimed at complete illusion of the senses, as in the instance recorded of his great picture. His style was modified by the contemplation of the sculptures of Phidias, and he taught the true method of grouping. His marked excellence was in the contrast of light and shade. He did not paint ideal excellence; he was not sufficiently elevated in his own moral sentiments to elevate the feelings of others. He painted sensuous beauty as it appeared in the models which he used. But he was greatly extolled and accumulated a great fortune, like Rubens, and lived ostentatiously, as rich and fortunate men ever have who do not possess elevation of sentiment. His headquarters were not at Athens, but at Ephesus, a city which also produced Parrhasins, to whom Zeuxis gave himself the palm, since he deceived the painter by his curtain, while Zeuxis only deceived birds by his grapes. Parrhasis established the rule of proportions, which was followed by succeeding artists. He was a very luxurious and arrogant man, and fancied he had reached the perfection of his art. But if that was ever reached among the ancients, it was by Apelles, the Titian of that day, who united the rich coloring of the Ionian school with the scientific severity of the school of Caesonia. He alone was permitted to paint the figure of Alexander, as Lysippus only was allowed to represent him in bronze. He invented ivory black, and was the first to cover his pictures with a coating of varnish, to bring out the colors and preserve them. His distinguishing excellency was grace, that artless balance of motion and repose, says Fuseli, springing from character and founded on propriety. Others may have equaled him in perspective, accuracy, and finish, but he added a refinement of taste which placed him on the throne which is now given to Raphael. No artist could complete his unfinished pictures. He courted the severest criticism, and, like Michael Angelo, had no jealousy of the fame of other artists. He reposed in the greatness of his own self-consciousness. He must have made enormous sums of money, since one of his pictures, a Venus rising out of the sea, painted for a temple in Cos, and afterwards removed by Augustus to Rome, cost 100 talents, equal to about $100,000, a greater sum, I apprehend, than was ever paid to a modern artist for a single picture, certainly in view of the relative value of gold. In this picture female grace was impersonated. After Apelles the art declined, although there were distinguished artists for several centuries. They generally flocked to Rome, where there was the greatest luxury and extravagance, and they pandered to vanity and a vitiated taste. The masterpieces of the old artists brought enormous sums, as the works of the old masters do now, and they were brought to Rome by the conquerors, as the masterpieces of Italy and Spain and Flanders were brought to Paris by Napoleon. So Rome gradually possessed the best pictures of the world, without stimulating the art, or making new creations. It could appreciate genius, but creative genius expired with Grecian liberties and glories. Rome multiplied and rewarded painters, but none of them were famous. Pictures were as common as statues. Even Varro, a learned writer, had a gallery of 700 portraits. Pictures were placed in all the baths, theatres, temples, and palaces, as were statues. We are forced, therefore, to believe that the Greeks carried painting to the same perfection that they did sculpture, not only from the praises of critics like Cicero and Pliny, but from the universal enthusiasm which the painters created and the enormous prices they received. Whether Polygnotus was equal to Michelangelo, Zeuxis to Titian, and Apelles to Raphael, we cannot tell. Their works have perished. What remains to us in the mural decorations of Pompeii and the design on vases seem to confirm the criticisms of the ancients. We cannot conceive how the Greek painters could have equalled the great Italian masters, since they had fewer colors, and did not make use of oil, but of gums mixed with the whites of eggs, and resin and wax, which mixture we call encaustic. Yet it is not the perfection of colors or of design, or mechanical aids, or exact imitations, or perspective skill, which constitute the highest excellence of the painter, but his power of creation, the power of giving ideal beauty and grandeur and grace, inspired by the contemplation of eternal ideas, an excellence which appears in all the masterworks of the Greeks, and such has not been surpassed by the moderns. But art was not confined to architecture, sculpture, and painting alone; it equally appears in all the literature of Greece. The Greek poets were artists, as also the orators and historians in the highest sense. They were the creators of style in writing, which we do not see in the literature of the Jews or other Oriental nations, marvellous and profound as were their thoughts. The Greeks had the power of putting things so as to make the greatest impression on the mind. This especially appears among such poets as Sophocles and Euripides, such orators as Pericles and Demosthenes, such historians as Xenophon and Thucydides, such philosophers as Plato and Aristotle. We see in their finished productions no repetitions, no useless expressions, no superfluity, no redundancy, no careless arrangement, no words even in bad taste, save in the abusive epithets in which the orators indulged. All is as harmonious in their literary style as in plastic art, while we read unexpected pleasures arise in the mind, based on beauty and harmony, somewhat similar to the enjoyment of artistic music, or as when we read Voltaire, Rousseau, or Macaulay. We perceive art in the arrangement of sentences, in the rhythm, in the symmetry of construction. We see means adapted to an end. The Latin races are most marked for artistic writing, especially the French, who seem to be copyists of Greek and Roman models. We see very little of this artistic writing among the Germans, who seem to disdain it as much as an English lawyer or statesman does rhetoric. It is in rhetoric and poetry that art most strikingly appears in the writings of the Greeks, and this was perfected by the Athenian sophists. But all the Greeks, and after them the Romans, especially in the time of Cicero, sought the graces and fascinations of style. Style is an art, and all art is eternal. It is probable also that art was manifested to a high degree in the conversation of the Greeks, as they were brilliant talkers, like Brougham, Mackintosh, Madame de Staël, and Macaulay in our times. But I may not follow out, as I could wish, this department of art, generally overlooked, certainly not dwelt upon like pictures and statues. An interesting and captivating writer or speaker is as much an artist as a sculptor or musician, and unless authors possess art their works are apt to perish, like those of Varro, the most learned of the Romans. It is the exquisite art seen in all the writings of Cicero which makes them classic; it is the style rather than the ideas. The same may be said of Horace. It is his elegance of style and language which makes him immortal. It is this singular fascination of language and style which keeps Hume on the list of standard and classic writers, like Pascal, Goldsmith, Voltaire, and Fénelon. It is on account of these excellences that the classical writers of antiquity will never lose their popularity, and for which they will be imitated, and by which they have exerted their vast influence. Art, therefore, in every department was carried to high excellence by the Greeks, and they thus became the teachers of all succeeding races and ages. Artists are great exponents of civilization. They are generally learned men, appreciated by the cultivated classes, and usually associated with the rich and proud. The popes rewarded artists while they crushed reformers. I never read of an artist who was persecuted. Men do not turn with disdain or anger in disputing with them, as they do from great moral teachers. Artists provoke no opposition, and stir up no hostile passions. It is the men who propound agitating ideas, and who revolutionize the character of nations, that are persecuted. Artists create no revolutions, not even of thought. Savonarola kindled a greater fire in Florence than all the artists whom the Medici ever patronized. But if the artists cannot wear the crown of apostles and reformers and sages, the men who saved the nations, men like Socrates, Luther, Bacon, Descartes, Burke, yet they have fewer evils to contend with in their progress, and they still leave a mighty impression behind them, not like that of Moses and Paul, but still an influence. They kindle the enthusiasm of a class that cannot be kindled by ideas, and furnish inexhaustible themes of conversation to cultivated people, and make life itself graceful and beautiful, enriching our houses, and adorning our consecrated temples, and elevating our better sentiments. The great artist is himself immortal, even if he contributes very little to save the world. Art seeks only the perfection of outward form; it is mundane in its labors; it does not aspire to those beatitudes which shine beyond the grave. And yet it is a great and invaluable assistance to those who would communicate great truths, since it puts them in attractive forms and increases the impression of the truths themselves. To the orator, the historian, the philosopher, and the poet, a knowledge of the principles of art is as important as to the architect, the sculptor, and the painter; and these principles are learned only by study and labor, while they cannot be even conceived of by ordinary men. Thus it would appear that in all departments and in all developments of art the Greeks were the teachers of the modern European nations, as well of the ancient Romans; and their teachings will be invaluable to the nations which are yet to rise, since no great improvement has been made on the models which have come down to us, and no new principles have been discovered which were not known to them. In everything which pertains to art they were benefactors of the human race, and gave a great impulse to civilization. Authorities: Müller's De Fideis Vita; Vitruvius, Aristotle; Pliny, Ovid, Martial, Lucian, and Cicero have made criticisms on ancient art. The modern writers are very numerous, especially among the Germans and the French. From these may be selected Winckelmann's History of Ancient Art, Müller's Remains of Ancient Art, Donaldson's Antiquities of Athens, Sir W. Gill's Pompeiana, Montfanson's Antiquités expliquées en figures, Ancient Marbles of the British Museum, by Taylor Combe, Meyer's Kunstgeschichte, Cleghorn's Ancient and Modern Art, Wilkinson's Topography of Thebes, Dodwell's Classical Tour, Wilkinson's Ancient Egyptians, Flaxman's Lectures on Sculpture, Fuseli's Lectures, Sir Joshua Reynolds's Lectures. Also see 5 articles on Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture in the Encyclopaedia Britannica and in Smith's Dictionary. End of Section 15.